Would you like to hear about the cool new two-player asymmetric wargame from the folks who brought you Anachrony? The worker placement game where you send workers back in time. The people who brought you Septima, an underrated and beautiful Eurogame about running a coven of witches. The amorphous mass of neurons and synapses that brought you Cerebria, the inside world. The first ever game that lets you have feelings. You Ironwood. Like to hear about this game? Well, let's do that then. I'm filming this video immediately after coming back from Essen Spiel, so please ignore any evidence that might suggest that I'm completely cooked. In this rather handsome production, you and exactly one other friend will be vying for control of the woodland, but you're not playing cats or birds or lizards, you're humans. One of you will pilot the burly metal Ironclad, just the lads for short, who carve out a space for themselves with colonial force, machine guns, plated armor, and a big flippin' drill that zips around like a 100-ton metal dog. It likes digging too. The other player takes the role of the Woodwalkers, the native inhabitants of this land who just want to be left alone. But with this oppressive force crushing down on them, they're resorting to more drastic measures. They're all bows and arrows, fireside ceremonies, and guerrilla warfare, and their taupe wooden pieces directly contrast with the weighty metal of the Ironclad. New versus old, industry versus tradition, capital versus life. It's a tale as old as time, just like James Cameron's Avatar, The Last Airbender, one of my favourite mangas. The flow of the game is super straightforward. Take turns playing single cards from your hand and resolving their actions. And these cards are built from a steady hand of 3 that you'll always have access to, supplemented with weirder additional cards from this big personalized deck. Now, cards will let you get up to all kinds of shenanigans, but chiefly they'll let you move and fight. The Ironclad use these mountains and paths to move around the map, whilst the Woodwalkers slip around in the wooded spaces between the spaces, Vagabond style. Fighting is resolved the same, regardless of what side you're playing. You'll use these values at the tops of the cards to add attack and defense values to the units involved, to work out casualties, and ultimately a victor. But far more interesting than these more universal systems that both players have access to are the unique tools that differentiate the two factions, and these are the tools that will also help them ultimately win the game. The goal of the Woodwalkers is to find totems in the forest, and then escort them off the board as fast as possible. 3 in the bag, and they win the game. Now, only the Woodwalkers know the precise locations of these totems before they're discovered, but a savvy Ironclad player might see a large force gathering in one particular clearing. Maybe that's their sign that they're gonna get a little totem, but maybe it's a bluff, and actually it's over with this little gentleman who's gonna sneak it out the back. On the flip side, the Ironclad wants to build 3 of these forges, but doing that is a really costly action that spends a whole fistful of these chunky blue crystals, Ironwood's most important resource. Now, the way that the Ironclad get these crystals is by moving the drill. Every time it turns up in a new space, it hoovers up a couple of nuggets along the way, like a giant metal street sweeper. Returning it to the centre of the map offloads its cargo, to be spent either on hot new building projects that'll win them the game, or to recruit new troops and pay for expensive cards. But here is the twist. The Woodwalkers also want to use that very same currency. They too can use it to pay for expensive cards or recruit new units onto the board, but they have very few ways of actually producing it themselves that don't rely on attacking the Ironclad, raiding their stuff. They can either attack the drill, blowing it up and carting away as many gems as they can carry, or they can raid the fortress in the middle of the map, stealing directly from their pockets. And this maneuver is often most effective when you've tempted their forces away with the promise of a totem retrieval, only to come in and stab them and steal them and Now, this strange economy, with one faction readily able to produce and the other only able to get those same resources by stealing them, tips the hand to Ironwood's more interesting and developed asymmetries. It's a really odd system that immediately gets players to fill a certain pair of shoes, enter into that soupy role-playing space that's reflected on the cards as well. The Woodwalkers are all rituals and traps and surprises. The Ironclad instead have surveillance towers, patrols, and artillery. It builds into these stories of brutal raids and drastic crackdowns, a really textured head-to-head game. And this is where I wanted to spotlight Ironwood's most controversial feature. You see, some of the people that I've played this with, or I've chatted to about this game with, have found that often they can slip past each other during the game, ships in the night, that the game can feel like a foot race rather than a wrestling match. And I'm going to make the case that this is a feature, not a bug. But, it is certainly a matter of taste if you're going to enjoy it. Both of the factions in Ironwood are quite able to reliably act out their plans and win the game quite quickly, so it is a foot race in a way, until someone decides to trip their opponent up. My favourite games of Ironwood have this wonderful arc where you have this slow start where players set up their board positions, establish some board presence, get the right cards in their hand, and then someone throws a little spanner into the works. And a bigger spanner comes back, and then you throw a bigger spanner at them, and then they throw a bigger spanner at you, and so on and so forth until there's spanners everywhere, the board is getting completely chaotic, and these desperate bids for victory start emerging amongst big, bloody conflicts. It's great stuff. The two goals of the different factions aren't linked, which makes thematic sense, but also drives an approach that needs you to engage in some actively nasty maneuvers. The game isn't going to force you into direct conflict, and also, it's not like Root, where your objectives could be a little opaque because there's multiple players around the table who all score points completely differently. In Ironwood, it's just you and your opponent, and you both win the game in the same way, by collecting 3 of these hexagonal tokens. And the means by which you do that might be different, but not so different that it completely alienates your opponent. All the actions that relate to those pieces are in that little 3-card hand that you'll always have. Which means both you and your opponent can reliably work out some parts of your opponent's strategy, most importantly, the parts that let you score points. But also, I should talk more about these cards. To me, 2-player games are always defined by how knowable they are, which usually comes in the form of more or less abstract design tendencies. If you lean too far out of abstraction, you have something that's rich and thematic and textural and gooey, but maybe a little less competitively viable, a little less knowable for you and your opponent. Go too far into abstract and you end up with Zord, a game of putting wooden cube next to plastic cylinder. If your opponent rotates the titular Zord 3 times, then you'll be zweckmated and forced to concede. Ironwood fits far more on the thematic side of the spectrum, which isn't to say that it's devoid of the abstract stylings that make a really sharp and competitive 2-player game. It's just more on that side of the balance, a little soupier than some might like. I really enjoy the approach here, with your hand made of 3 knowable and dependable tent poles that are then supplemented with characterful extra cards that do all kinds of weird stuff. But after quite a few games, the breadth of these cards still remains like a little bit unknowable. It's always surprising what your opponent has planned. They'll always sneak something in that you didn't expect. But that might be frustrating for folks who want something that's a little bit more knowable and dependable in their 2-player games. These produce big, thematic, exciting moments, but they don't produce moments where you go, a fine move. They're much more, whoa, that was cool. And there's a difference, a really important difference in there. That lick of unpredictability in what your opponent can do makes for great stories, but can't touch the same sparky tactics of something like Air, Land and Sea, Targi, or Fugitive. Which is not to say that it's trying to do that. This game is a very different prospect from those games. And I've really enjoyed the stories that this box has told. I've enjoyed seeing a wry smile curl on my opponent's lip as they plan something devilish. Ironwood isn't reinventing the wheel, but it's slick, it's stylish, it's immediate, and I think it's quite a lot of fun. And while you're here, what else might you like in this arena? It seems ridiculous to say it again, and again, but we just recently reviewed another game in the Undaunted series. They might be our favourite head-to-head games just because of how well they marry their juicy themes and abstract tactics. Matt also reviewed Compile recently, but I might stick my oar in here and say that Air, Land and Sea might be my preferred title. A little bit easier to pass, a little more knowable, letting you get in your opponent's head. It seems like this month we've only reviewed 2-player games. If we had the foresight, we'd probably like brand it as like 2-player month or something like that. Maybe it's unofficially 2-player month now. Yeah, maybe that's it. Unless the next game isn't a 2-player game, in which case 2-player month is cancelled. You were gone before we even knew ye. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next week. Bye.